Reese-Mandel. Kyle Reese-Mandel. Such a Jewish. Of course he's Jewish. Yeah. Billy DeFranco feller. Can't trust a word he says. He's one of them satanic pedophiles. I know it. Look at his name. Billy DeFranco. PDF. Well, this is basically the Philly DeFranco file we're watching right now. The PD file. The PDF file. He's one of them, I'm telling you, it's all in the name. It's there in the signs, son, it's there in the signs.
Moral panics aren't new, but how they're now being weaponized to push agendas and distract people from real societal issues should concern you. If you watch My Daily Show with any regularity, you know just how much LGBTQ issues have taken center stage in American politics. Or for the past few years, how many times have you seen Republicans just frothing at the mouth about trans people, drag queens, whatever they want to label as wokeness that week? Which seems to be a puzzling amount of anxiety to be directed at a group that makes up just 1.6% of the population when it comes to trans and non-binary people. Politicians, talking heads, and social media have overinflated it to the point that in a survey...
And by the way, this isn't just this is like Billy DeFranco decided to devote an entire 10 minutes to this subject, so I'm just going to put it all on. You guys will enjoy this.
Last year, the average American guessed the share of trans people to be 21%. And it's this exaggeration of a smaller, often non-existent issue, then the whipping up of the fear and hostility around that issue that makes this what sociologists call a moral panic. Right? It's a recurring phenomenon that pops up in different forms, with the Satanic Panic of the 80s being the most famous. That also being the one that inspired me to learn more about how they work. So to that end, I spoke with 4 experts, starting with Dr. Mary DeYoung, formerly a professor of sociology at Grand Valley State University. And she says that these moral panics, which come in reaction to perceived social change and confusion around morality and identity, are almost universally right-wing. Or just think about the big ones. You have witch hunts, Red Scare, the Satanic Panic.
Billy DeFranco is starting to see the links, and in fact, getting sociologists and psychologists to explain the links to the common people. I am so happy. This 10-minute segment here, it feels to me like it might be a response to Anthony Padilla, genuinely, because Billy DeFranco has covered Anthony Padilla's career a lot. I think it's a response to him.
They had a certain regressive quality to them in that they were trying to restore something.
But it also, I love that he's talking about that and he is establishing that point of how moral panics connect to the right wing, because that's something I've been saying about Dissociated. She's a secret trad wife right wing primer, and
that people imagine were either lost or...
Anthony Padilla spoke to one of the larger figures of the current SRA movement.
Or were being threatened.
And she told us that as the conversations around different gender identities and sexual orientations enter the mainstream, some people feel like the traditional categories they identify with are being destabilized. So to alleviate this feeling, they deny the reality of these different identities. Right? And the targets and rationale, they're kind of just tweaks on each other. I think about conservatives saying trans people aren't real, or it's all just a mental illness. Often the same people who say gay people are just making a choice, or they're just confused. And instead, they blame an entity outside what they consider the in-group for introducing the confusion. Currently, a great example of that is the panic around teachers grooming students or kids going to drag queen story time, with the men in the end feeling like their own identity is still intact by expelling the other. So that takes care of the identity confusion, but the moral confusion requires a different solution, which DeYoung argues is why children are so often made the object of anxiety, where the scene is pure and innocent, so their abuse is obviously morally unambiguous. Plus, that kind of self-certainty gives you permission to shut down any detractors.
If you say, oh, I don't believe that, the response from somebody who does is, do you not care about kids? Do you not care about sexual abuse?
With DeYoung adding that this sense of moral clarity also feeds into a basic human need deep within our psyche.
Most of us operate, I think, under a kind of fundamental assumption that social psychologists call the just world hypothesis, that there is order, there is morality, that people get what they deserve, whether for good acts or for bad acts.
We also have Dr. Michael Barbazet, a historian at the Australian Catholic University, offering a different explanation for this obsession with kids, saying children, being the next generation, essentially represent the future. So if you're afraid of where the future's headed, you're going to defend children. And supposedly that fear is why moral panics tend to flare up at times of crisis or instability, with the same pattern repeating so often throughout history that experts actually coined a term for it, the nocturnal ritual fantasy. Right? In essence, it's this idea that shadowy groups secretly get together to worship forces of evil and ritualistically abuse children.
Historians will often say that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And this is one of those rhymes. It changes through time with the groups of people we don't like. So if you're an ancient Roman who's a pagan, you think Christians are doing this. If you're a medieval Christian, you think bad Christians are doing this, or Jews are doing this, or lepers are doing this, people your culture doesn't like. Later on in the Renaissance, you think witches are doing this. And in all of these cases, none of these people accused of it were doing it. If you read the sources for all of these supposed conspiracies, you'll be struck with how similar it seems, where you have these secret meetings. Sometimes they're underground, sometimes they're in the woods. There will generally be, of course, invocations to evil. If it's Satan, if your culture believes in Satan, cats somehow get involved. People with dark skin somehow get involved. There's always some kind of freaky orgy for some reason. And then they hurt kids.
With adding that this conspiracy appears again and again over centuries from sources that had no contact with one another, suggesting that it may just be hardwired into our culture. And in today's moral panic, you can see it most clearly in the QAnon movement. Right? They've got the global cabal, the perverse rituals, the child abuse, even a little Satanism thrown in there. But also, despite the universal similarities, our moral panic has its own uniquely American origins. With Dr. Kyle Reismandel, a historian at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, explaining that the idea of childhood had to be constructed for these conspiracies to work at all.
Coming out of the progressive era of the late 19th century, the idea of childhood emerges, right? That like children are somehow
Isn't this just perfect coverage of this subject?
and therefore different than, adults and eventually what are called teenagers, because in the 19th century, early 20th century, children were working in mines and factories and contributed to the family economy on the farm, right?
And then he says the idea of innocent children was placed in the suburbs. We're not talking like the literal geographic area between urban and rural that you can outline on a map. Rather, we're talking about these suburbs.
Trip, have you noticed the psychologists talking about it? Or heard their names?
As an idea, a symbol or an image that's typically seen as
The psychologists and sociologists know.
the family-friendly home of American moral values. And after World War II, that space became racialized through policies like redlining, which kept Black Americans from accessing mortgages. Meanwhile, the federal government subsidized home ownership for middle-class whites, making it cheaper to buy a house in the suburbs than to rent an apartment in cities like New York, Boston, or Philadelphia. And at the same time, men are
Maybe that's my anti-Semitism.
returning back home from war to find women working traditionally masculine jobs, so they reestablish themselves as the head of the household.
The idea of the breadwinner is
Reismandel. Kyle Reismandel. This is such a Jewish. Of course he's Jewish. Yeah.
a relatively recent invention. That's a post-war invention. And it's invented because men could go to work and afford, right, make enough money to have a household, provide all the consumer goods, and have their spouse not work, right? And not work in a sort of paid sense. They're obviously working at home.
So this all adds up to the popular image of a suburban family that's white, heteronormative, patriarchal, and Christian, with the pure, innocent child at its center. But that image could only be maintained by creating an external threat, and this came first from radio, then from television, which introduced cultural products into the home that would supposedly corrupt children. And so then you got parents freaking out about their kids listening to rock music, watching explicit movies, playing Dungeons and Dragons.
And all the media is owned by the Jews.
The evil stuff. And then when you throw into the mix a late 70s economic crisis, racial integration,
No, Lex, I think this is the sort of content that's really good for de-radicalizing normies. I think this is the sort of stuff that people like your mum will just listen to and just be like, oh, he's right, yeah. I think this is the sort of content that's great at that.
and the return of many women to work out of necessity, you can see how America was ripe for a moral panic.
Normies don't get de-radicalized by people like me. They get de-radicalized a slower path. And it's through slower heads.
Which, of course, is exactly what happened with Reagan defending so-called family values, Jerry Falwell conjuring the moral majority.
It's events that she'll know, she'll understand, and seeing it spelled out and painted this way, she'll be like, oh, yeah, okay, I see.
And the media hyping up missing kids and poison Halloween candy. Meanwhile, rising single motherhood and divorce rates produce broken families, and all the fucked up shit going on behind closed doors begins coming out into the open, where, key thing, it's labeled as trauma for the first time, as DeYoung explains.
People often forget that
Being gay used to be trauma, and they're still trying to say it.
it really wasn't until the 1980s that the word trauma was used effectively and descriptively to talk about things that we had never talked about before that period of time. Child sexual abuse, incest.
This is true. Shell shock wasn't about the trauma you'd experienced. It just referred to the malaise and all the rest. They thought it came from the loud noises of the bombs. All the rest of it. And certainly that was an aspect. Certainly it was, but I don't think the word trauma was used in its description even once, probably.
Domestic violence, the fear of what the impact of all of this would have on children.
Psychological trauma was a early 20th century discovery or understanding for that trauma referred specifically, I believe, to physical.
Particularly if children perhaps weren't really as well cared for as we imagine they were in previous generations, caused a lot of unsettled feelings.
So to cope with all this, the religious right makes the devil not only real, but responsible for people's distress, leading to the Satanic Panic, in which dozens of people are actually convicted on cooked-up charges, some of them even spending years in prison before being exonerated.
This is a response to that recent Padilla video, though, isn't it?
But as a result, very big thing, all of the actual abuse and crimes being committed in churches, in schools, in the Boy Scouts, that goes unnoticed.
One of the benefits is the structural arrangements of people in power and patriarchal privilege in that were really protected as we went running wild, looking for these satanic abusers.
Which is at the very least ironic, because it means that the very thing the panic is about, right, the abuse of children, is actually being swept under the rug by the panic itself. But arguably, that's also the entire point, to distract people not just from those individual crimes, but also the unpopular economic policies. And so today that can look like Ron DeSantis waging his war on so-called wokeness. Meanwhile, you got
This Philly DeFranco feller, can't trust a word he says. He's one of them satanic pedophiles. I know it. Look at his name. Philly DeFranco, PDF. Well, this is basically the Philly DeFranco file we're watching right now. The PD file, the PDF file. He's one of them, I'm telling you. It's all in the name. It's there in the signs. Son, it's there in the signs. The timestamp of this video, it's 19 minutes and 11 seconds long. That's like date 1911. We all know what happened in 1911. Don't we, kids? The Masonic 33rd Order of High Masonic Wizards conducted a secret satanic ritual. Philly DeFranco knows. He's one of them.
the Florida's homeowner insurance market imploding as companies stop covering zip codes damaged by Hurricane Ian and premiums skyrocket. And that's without mentioning the state consistently ranking near the bottom for healthcare, school funding, long-term elder care. And you can also see this replicated at the federal level, with Republicans harping on culture war issues while they cut taxes for the rich and cut funding for social programs. None of which, by the way, is new, right? Dr. Andrew Hartman, a historian at Illinois State University, says these culture wars have been going on since the beginning.
Throughout the 19th century,
And that's why cats are the real homeowners, because you can't spell homeowner without meow.
culture wars were often between the dominant Protestant groups who controlled most institutions, political
And this is why it was Protestant versus Catholic back in the day.
and cultural institutions in the United States, especially the schools, and Catholics or Mormons or non-Protestant Christians. There have been these struggles throughout American history, but since the 1960s, these struggles have largely been between those who are liberal, progressive, secular.
And the thing is, if you're an atheist, you're not going to be a Satan-worshipping pedophile. You might be a pedo, but you're not going to be Satan-worshipping. But if you believe in God, if you're a Christian, you believe in the devil. And that opens you up to real Satanism. That opens you up to, anyway, being a bad Christian and Christian fucking abuse.
And then on the other side, these have been conservative Christian traditionalists who have imagined an American identity rooted in a more distant past.
So Hartman says
And then we see this with what Milo and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Nick Fuentes talk about too.
that since then, while the left has made real progress on cultural issues like racism, sexism,
Who have
Also, I'd just like to point out the next historian, Andrew Hartman. I'm just saying, all of the sociologists, psychologists, and historians that Philly spoke to for this segment happen to have Jewish ancestry at the least, which is interesting.
imagined an American
We're all out here fighting this little battle, it seems.
identity rooted in a more distant past.
So Hartman says that since then, while the left has made real progress on cultural issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, the right has also used the reactionary backlash against the progress to push through their economic agenda, which creates this really weird dilemma, right? Because when Republicans attack some marginalized group, you have a choice. Either push back against them, in which case you're fighting on their terms and the economic issues and all the other issues recede into the background, or you ignore them and you focus on the economy where they don't have a leg to stand on, in which case you're just leaving.
Also, that guy is actually just straight out of Death Stranding, Hartman. Badass. Love him.
those marginalized people out to dry. So how to navigate this situation is a question activists have been debating for decades.
I mean, there's a Hartman
Obviously,
as
I'm
well.
not going to be able
Die
to settle
Hartman.
that. But I did ask DeYoung, how can we
Wait, there's a Hartman, there's a DeYoung. I think DeYoung is as good as Die Hardman.
deflate this moral panic? And she recommends
This is Death Stranding. It's all Death Stranding.
interrupting the cycle of fear, and to do so with some Socratic questioning to nudge people toward critical thinking. So there, even she's pessimistic, saying it'll probably just collapse under its own weight like the Satanic Panic did, though not entirely disappear. Instead, going dormant and then flaring up 10 or 20 years from now wearing different clothing.
Sexy Phil, he's not sexy. Sexy Phil, he's sexy.
Oh my god, he hasn't done the Sexy Phil song in a while. Jesus. That was a blast from the past. Oh, because these things will ever just always pop up every 10 or 20 years. That was a clever little joke. Sexy Phil. But yeah, fucking great, Mark. Oh, that useful to know. I think well spoken about there, and I think just a really useful bit of content for the normieverse. I'm glad. It gives me hope watching normies like him cover it in such a wonderfully normie, still scary manner, but it's just like, it was good. That was good coverage. It was really good coverage. It was like, we never get good coverage of this stuff. Normally the coverage happens and I'm like, it's missing the point. And you know what? That hit 95% of the points in a very rapid fire bit of time. That was pretty good. It was pretty good. I think if they'd mentioned the Jewish connection, the problem is if you mention stuff like the Jewish connection right now, it's actually going to make the anti-Semitism worse, because it will bring a whole bunch of people into the realization that this stuff connects to Jews. You know what I mean? So I almost feel like it was a good thing him more focusing on the Christian element of it all in that regards. Thank you so much for watching, Loungers. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a comment, you fucking arsehole.